It was during COVID in 2020. PETA released stunning video and information on experimenter Elisabeth Murray and her monkey Fright lab at the National Institutes of Health. Hi, I'm Emil Guillermo, and welcome to this special reprise of the PETA Podcast. PETA was the first organization to reveal that Murray was burning out parts of monkeys' brains and then frightening them with fake snakes and spiders. Since then, PETA has waged a massive campaign and even filed a first-of-its-kind lawsuit after reviewing veterinary records showing that monkeys were kept hungry and thirsty to coerce them to cooperate. Many were so stressed they pulled out their own hair. Some have suffered from diarrhea for years. Some have lived alone in their tiny metal cages for more than a decade. Now that NIH is modernizing and has said it's prioritizing animal-free research, PETA is hopeful these monkeys will finally be spared and is pressing for closure. Please listen to this special encore from 2020 to understand why. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. And this week, PETA exposed the multi-million-dollar taxpayer-funded monkey torture by the National Institutes of Health, and one scientist in particular, Elisabeth Murray. It took a court fight, but PETA got more than 40 hours of video and is now letting the public see how the experiments are done at NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. Murray actually carves out a monkey's skull and induces permanent brain damage to the monkeys. And then she exposes them to artificial snakes and spiders to see how they respond. She's paid millions for that. Dr. Katherine Roe is a researcher with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department. She worked on the same floor as Murray at NIH at one time before she came to work at PETA. Dr. Roe talks about the monkey fright experiments on the PETA Podcast. Tell me, Katherine, about these videos. The videos are really at the cornerstone of the news. It's like the evidence, right? Here it is. They're doing these experiments. Well, what do the videos show?
Well, what the videos show, and listeners can see them for themselves at PETA.org, are monkeys in a laboratory at the National Institute of Mental Health who have been deliberately given brain damage and then are being subjected to fear-inducing experiments where they are locked in a tiny little cage. A guillotine door that's kept them in the dark suddenly flies open, startling them, and then they're presented with what for monkeys are very frightening stimuli, such as snakes and spiders that sometimes move. And the experimenters are basically measuring what the monkeys do in these situations and what the effects of the brain damage that they have deliberately induced has on those behaviors.
So they first induce brain damage on the monkeys?
Exactly. So what they're doing is cutting these monkeys' skulls open and injecting them with a toxin that damages their neurons and causes what's called a lesion, which is basically brain damage. Sometimes they cut parts of the brain away. Sometimes they use these toxins to kill off neurons. And sometimes they suction part of the brain away to deliberately cause these monkeys behavioral problems with social interactions, problem with fear regulations, that sort of thing.
And so once they do that, what does that, and then they gauge the monkey's reaction to snakes and these other insects, which to a normal monkey, they would react the same way, or what? Why would they have to induce brain damage? Why is that essential to the experiment?
What they're trying to determine is which parts of the brain are important for regulating behavior. We know, of course, from human research that there are certain parts of the brain that are critical and work together to allow us to behave appropriately in the face of, say, frightening stimuli. What they're doing is damaging parts of the monkey's brains to see what that effect has on their behavior.
So they can isolate where the fear is replicated or where it's sparked in the brain? Is that sort of the way we can look at it?
Well, I think that that's their theory. I don't think that that's the actuality. What we do know from human research is that there's a network of brain regions that are critical for these behaviors. What these experimenters are doing is damaging very specific parts of the monkey's brains just to see if this brain region or that brain region is critical for a particular behavior. And they've been doing this just over and over and over again. The researcher, whose name is Elisabeth Murray, has been doing this for more than 30 years.
Wow. More than 30 years. That's like a generation. And has she accomplished anything in those 30 years?
She has not accomplished any new treatment or cure for any human illness or contributed anything meaningful to benefit human health.
All right. Now, some people might say, oh, that's your judgment, Dr. Roe, but is in fact anything positive coming out of those experiments that she's conducted?
I don't think so. We know that if you're interested in studying which parts of the human brain are important for regulating behavior, which is what they're purporting to do, you can study that in humans. And many, many, many laboratories are doing exactly that. So these experiments are basically torturing monkeys and getting nowhere at the tune of more than $36 million in the past 13 years alone. These are very expensive experiments. They're very cruel experiments, and they're useless experiments.
So more than $40 million or nearly $40 million?
Nearly $40 million in just the past 13 years. But these experiments have been going on for far longer than that. So the grand total is probably more than that. It is more than that.
So what would Murray say that she's trying to accomplish, and how would you critique that?
Well, I think that the argument that would get made by Murray or the National Institute of Mental Health is that we think that the brain regions that they're damaging in these monkeys may be affected in humans with neuropsychiatric illnesses, such as depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or conduct disorder. However, in those populations, we know, again, from well-conducted human research studies that their brain regions aren't damaged the way that Elisabeth Murray is damaging these monkeys. Humans with these neuropsychiatric illnesses have much more subtle structural abnormalities in their brain. They have neurochemical imbalances in their brain. And the behaviors that they have difficulty with are much more complex than how they respond to a jumping spider or a moving snake in a cage.
And so you would argue that there are better ways to get at the goal that they're trying to reach, eh?
I would absolutely argue that there are many ways to get at the goal that they're trying to reach. One is they could actually study, and many people do, study humans who have had damage to these regions of the brain naturally. Humans can get lesions from strokes or head injuries, and many researchers study those humans and look at what the behavioral consequences of those injuries are. You probably know that there are many ways to image the human brain while it's doing certain behavioral tasks and look at which parts of the brain are critical for performing those tasks. There's even a relatively new technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which allows researchers to non-invasively and temporarily disable a part of the brain in a human and see how that affects their behavior. So there are many, many ways to look at what parts of the brain are important for these behaviors in humans and use that data to help patients with different neuropsychiatric illnesses.
So are you suggesting that we are already getting to the answer that Murray's science purports or her experiments purport to try to get at, and that essentially that would render her activities at nearly or over or more than $40 million somewhat irrelevant? No?
They are irrelevant. They're obsolete at this point. Technology and our ability to study the human brain have advanced well beyond the sort of experiments that are being conducted. And we could use the money that's being wasted, literally wasted on these experiments for these more relevant research methods.
You make a good point. I mean, it's always the bottom line. it's the money, taxpayer money at that. But there's also the matter that we're talking about monkeys' lives. I mean, how many monkeys has she subjected this to? And how many monkeys' lives has it cost over, say, the 30 years that she's been doing this?
Well, we don't currently have an exact number. We know that the number is at least in the dozens, but could be in the hundreds. And, like you said, we're talking about monkeys that are being held in captivity. They're having deliberate permanent brain damage induced. They're being subject to experiments that are designed to terrify them. And a lot of the monkeys in this laboratory are housed alone, which means that they're not getting any of the social stimulation that we know primates need. So essentially, these monkeys are being driven crazy, having horrific surgical procedures being performed on them, being terrified, all for nothing.
Is there any justification at all that would maybe give Murray something to stand behind and say, look, this is real science, there's a real purpose here, and it's really worth all the tens of millions of dollars that I'm spending on this experiment?
I think what, and in a lot of cases, most animal experimenters will say is that in a laboratory setting, they can control this variable or that variable. They can very precisely damage a particular part of the brain. They can control the experiences that the monkeys in this case are having, which you can't do when you're studying humans. Of course, one is that it makes the data not applicable to humans because humans don't live in a cage in isolation, eating the same food every day, not interacting with other humans. But in Murray's case, they don't even have the history of the monkeys that they're using. They don't know if they were deprived of any maternal care. We don't know how old each of the monkeys were when they received these lesions, which is a key point in how it would affect their brain. I mean, even in this quote unquote controlled laboratory setting, critical variables aren't being controlled. And again, if you're trying to understand human mental illness or human neuropsychiatric illness, human neuropsychiatric patients don't have large parts of their brain obliterated. They have very subtle functional and structural or neurochemical differences that cause them behavioral difficulties. It's not lesions, which is what she's doing in her laboratory.
So even in the best instance of this experiment, still more questions than answers, and thereby, I guess that's been the trick at how to continue to suck millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars to fund these, I won't pass judgment and say useless experiments, but to keep the ongoing inquiry going and to keep Murray gainfully employed, really.
Well, again, remember that in the scientific community, and what people don't always realize, but it's true, is that success is not measured by whether or not your experiments actually result in some benefit for humans, but whether they result in a publication in a scientific journal or funding. So as long as these experiments get published and as long as the National Institute of Mental Health keeps funding them, she'll be allowed to continue this cruelty, even though it's not generating any meaningful results for humans.
For a layperson like myself, this is something that I don't necessarily get. If we're going to spend money, we want to see results, but the result can just simply be, hey, I did this, I found this, I published it. It doesn't mean we're making any progress. The progress is we're further along, maybe in, microns from, where we were when we started, but this is science, right? I mean, is that kind of the attitude that we all must take when we view Murray, if we want to see it in a positive light?
No, I think that's exactly how it works is, again, if you publish something that if you conduct an experiment that is interesting to somebody and it's published, that's considered justification to do it again or to get more money and to keep your job. And the yardstick isn't whether or not, even after in Murray's case, 30 plus years of doing these sorts of experiments, anything meaningful for human health has resulted. And in her case, it hasn't.
Should there be a better standard applied by NIH, which is the world's most famous research institution? Because it seems like if this is happening with Murray, there must be others that we don't even know about yet. And certainly to get the evidence to show what Murray does took what would seem to me to be an extraordinary effort, FOIAs and whatnot, and lawsuits. Does NIH need a better way to measure whether or not an experimenter gets funded?
Absolutely. I think that would be critical in, one, getting animals out of laboratories, because as you know, and as I know, so many animal experiments continue not because they're benefiting humans, but because they're resulting in grant funding and in publications. And so, yes, I think that a better measure of the scientific value of any series of experiments should be its ability to benefit humans. Even if it is basic science research, it should be something that clinicians and therapists can utilize in their treatment towards people. Certainly within a time frame much shorter than what Elisabeth Murray's experiments have been allowed to continue. You know, we're talking about 30 plus years of curiosity-driven experiments that haven't helped anybody and have harmed possibly hundreds of monkeys.
Dr. Roe, and I use that term with all due respect, is it possible that we're seeing a generational shift in the scientific community and even at NIH? Murray's been doing this for more than 30 years. Are we beginning to see the end of these kind of ways? And is this a critical moment for NIH to change how they grant funds and how they declare what is permissible as research?
I think it could be. I mean, I think that the power to, as you said, transition what they fund and what they prioritize should be now. It should have been, 50 years ago, which is human relevant, humane research. Unfortunately, what happens is that graduate students, people that are just starting their research careers, if they end up in a lab that uses animals, they can often almost get stuck in those procedures because those are the types of experiments that they're trained on. And so what the NIH needs to do is not only get the laboratories that are currently using animals to transition to human relevant methods, but to really ask that young scientists, new scientists, don't get weighed down with these archaic methods.
What you're saying is that they leave a slight crack open for a new generation to develop and continue to fester with these archaic or maybe outdated methods that were shown by their mentors. And so they follow almost blindly. Is that an adequate way to describe what happens?
I think it is an inadequate way to describe what happens. And I can tell you my personal experience was to never test on animals, but it wasn't because I was at a young age very aware of both the cruelty that's involved, of which there is a lot, and the uselessness of animal experiments, but because I studied language and the brain's involvement in language. And so there wasn't a push for me as a scientist to try to develop an animal experiment, but the scientific community tends to not reveal the cruelty that's involved in animal experiments and tends to overstate the value. And so if you're a young scientist who looks up to the senior scientists in your department or in your institute who are doing these sorts of procedures and they say, oh, it's not that harmful, oh, it's very important, you tend to just believe it. And I think that the reality, which is that these experiments are incredibly cruel and incredibly harmful to animals and are incredibly useless when it comes to understanding human health, needs to be conveyed to the youngest scientists that we can convey it to so that they get on the right track. And I think that this is a feasible movement that the NIH could support, and it would be great for animals and it would be great for science.
I appreciate you bringing up the personal perspective, your personal perspective, Dr. Rowe, because you, in fact, used to work at NIH, used to work right, in the same vicinity as these experiments that, whose videos we've been talking about. When you see these videos, does it surprise you at all, number one? And did you have any idea that these kind of things were going on when you were there?
It does surprise me. Believe it or not, when you hear about these sorts of experiments, when you're in the community, and you're absolutely right, I worked at the National Institute of Mental Health. And when you say the vicinity, I do mean the vicinity, like down the hall from the experimenters that we're talking about. When you hear about these experiments, you don't hear all of the information. Number one is you don't see the videos. If there's any information depicted about these experiments, there are often cartoon drawings or schematics that show like a line drawing of a monkey and, some arrows and it's a very cartoon depiction of what the animal is experiencing. But yeah, I have been repeatedly shocked and appalled to see what types of cruelty were going on in my vicinity without my knowledge.
Had you known, I guess the question is, could you have done something? Or is there something, or how would you have felt had you known when you were there?
I think, that's a great question. I think when I was working there and everywhere that I've worked over my career, I really did believe that animals in laboratories didn't suffer. I know that sounds ridiculous, but because we know how much they suffer, but I didn't realize it at the time. And I don't know if I would have had the strength or the gumption or whatever word you want to use to speak out. I know that for a lot of my colleagues who were far smarter than I was at a younger age, who did try to speak out, they were basically shut down, and their colleagues and even their mentors basically told them, you're not allowed to say that animal experimentation is ethically wrong. You're not allowed to say that animal experimentation is scientifically invalid. And I don't know if you're familiar with the documentary Test Subjects, but you can see that within the scientific community, anyone who tries to speak out and say, wait a second, what are we doing here? This is cruel and it's not getting us anywhere, is basically ostracized for saying that. It's not a popular opinion. It's not a welcome opinion. And it's unfortunate because it's science. And scientists should be able to critique other people's science. And where else but in a laboratory should you evaluate the quality of science and, objectively, but it's considered unacceptable.
Well, it's kind of like a bullying mechanism built in, and science is revered. Science is held up there as, the objective standard of inquiry and whatnot. And I think from what you described, it sounds like it's more cultish than anything else. And if that's the case, how did you break free? How did you come up with the gumption or the courage to say, I can't do this?
Well, I was never asked to do it, thankfully. So I was never in a situation where somebody forced me to experiment on animals. And I think for me, it was a slow and steady process, which was really an educational process, learning about the type of procedures that animals are subject to, learning how inadequate the review procedures are for deciding whether or not an animal experiment should or should not even be conducted in the first place, and reviewing the data from animal experiments and seeing how flawed it is and how unlikely it is to result in anything beneficial for human health. And once I became informed on all of those things, the answer was obvious. It is not popular amongst my former colleagues. I can assure you of that, but it's right. And so I think once you have all of the information that I have now, there's no reason not to be courageous. It's not even courageous. It's just common sense. We need to stop doing this. It's cruel. It's ineffective. Let's stop.
Well, once you did it, once you saw the light, as it were, and you're saying it's just common sense. You're even downplaying the courage in the same way that the experimenters were downplaying their cruelty. Would it be that hard for your former colleagues to just get up and say, yeah, this isn't right. We need to do it another way?
Well, I think from a scientific point of view, it shouldn't be difficult at all. That is what science is. Science is advancing your methods, advancing your techniques to produce the best, most useful data possible. And we absolutely should expect taxpayer-funded experimenters and laboratories to put forth the best science possible. And these experiments do not qualify by any stretch of the imagination. I think what is harder is the ethical issue. I think that for any given scientist, whether they work with animals or experiment on animals or not, it is not considered appropriate to question the ethics of conducting these cruel experiments on animals. It's considered unscientific.
Katherine, I really appreciate your time. And I just want to go back to the videos that PETA fought to have released. They're out now. People can see it. What is the next step now that this has been exposed? Is it even possible that we can go back to the status quo, or what needs to be changed? What has to be done now at NIH and at the place where this cruelty is being meted out?
Right. Well, I do encourage listeners to go to PETA.org where they can see these cruel experiments for themselves. And one of the things that they can do is, with just a couple of clicks, ask NIH to stop using their taxpayer money to fund these cruel and ineffective experiments. What I can do and what PETA can do is engage with the agencies that fund these experiments, which includes the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Mental Health, talk to members of Congress who help decide what money goes where for health research, and hopefully convince the people who are conducting the experiments that they're cruel and that they're wasteful and that there are dozens of better ways that they can answer the types of questions they're trying to answer without harming animals.
I just have one question for myself, because as I try to come up with answers, how do you get people to change a system? It seems like it's all about money, and they have a belief that cruelty will get them the money because that's the way they're used to experiment. If there was a requirement to not have animals used, if there was maybe a bigger sector of experimentation or research funds that would go to non-animal experiments, do you think that would be the motivating factor that could bring over some of your former colleagues to doing it the right way, the more humane way, the anti-cruelty way?
I think that would absolutely make a tremendous difference because, again, in order for anybody to conduct research, they need funding. And so if the funding is being directed towards non-animal methods, people who are sort of, stuck with these old, outdated, archaic procedures would, I would assume, be motivated to update their methods and transition their techniques in order to get the funding and, quite frankly, do the sort of research that's actually going to benefit people.
And they don't have to appear so mercenary after all. They just do it for that reason.
That would be the right reason, would be that, one, it's cruel, to do these experiments, and two, it's not getting them the sort of answers that we need to help people. But if we need to do it by taking the funding away, then so be it.
Dr. Katherine Roe, a researcher with PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, on the NIH monkey fright experiments that have cost you tens of millions of dollars. See the video, go to the link in our show notes, or go to PETA.org. And that's our program. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog, that's the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. I write for them. Also, AMOK.com is my personal website. You know, I just got back from Portland, Oregon, where every once in a while at the end here, I'll just tell you about some of the vegan food I had. I went to Portland because, you know, sometimes you just have to have a good vegan donut, and Portland is kind of the vegan donut capital of the U.S., but it's not Voodoo. Don't go to Voodoo Donut necessarily. I mean, that's kind of like the culty favorite. But my two favorite places, well, my two favorite donuts, the pomegranate glazed donut at Dough Donuts, D-O-E, not Department of Energy, Dough. Like, you know, they have a little dough on the logo, donuts, right? And they have a motto, eat more whole foods, as in donut holes. Well, they're good. Dough Donuts, the pomegranate glazed. And then there's another place called Blue Star Donuts, the passion fruit and vanilla cake donut, oh, and the blueberry cake donut. Oh. Whenever I travel, I'll pass along these great vegan places. I paid for them all. They're not advertisers. Oh, and the vegan bagel and lox made of carrots at No Bones Beach Club. Once again, all Portland, Oregon, a vegan mecca. Hey, once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. Our music provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.